The date was November 9th, 1989. In the cold darkness of a Berlin evening, something impossible was happening. People were climbing onto a concrete barrier that had stood for 28 years, a wall that had split families, ended lives, and symbolized the division of an entire world. They carried hammers and pickaxes, tears streaming down their faces, chipping away at the structure that had once seemed eternal. This is the story of how that wall came to be, how it fell, and how the scars it left are still being healed today, piece by piece, in ways both physical and invisible. To understand what happened that November night, we must travel back to a time when Berlin was not one city, but two separate worlds existing side by side, separated by concrete, barbed wire, and the constant threat of death. But the story begins even earlier, in the ruins of World War II, when the smoke was still clearing from the greatest conflict humanity had ever known. The year was 1945. Berlin lay in rubble. The grand capital of the Third Reich had been bombed, burned, and broken. Bodies lined the streets. Buildings that had stood for centuries were reduced to hollow shells. In the devastation, four powers arrived to claim their share of victory: the United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. They divided Germany like a pie, each taking a slice. Berlin, deep in the Soviet zone, was itself divided into four sectors. It was meant to be temporary, a practical solution until Germany could stand on its own again. But something happened that nobody had planned for. The wartime allies began to drift apart. The Soviet Union, led by Joseph Stalin, wanted to spread its communist system across Eastern Europe. The Western powers, particularly the United States, saw this as a threat to freedom and democracy. Within just a few years of defeating Hitler together, these former allies were now enemies in what would be called the Cold War, a conflict fought, not with bullets and bombs, but with spies, threats, and the constant terror of nuclear annihilation. Berlin became the front line of this new war. By 1949, Germany had officially split into two nations: the Federal Republic of Germany in the West, aligned with America and capitalism, and the German Democratic Republic in the East, a communist state controlled by the Soviet Union. West Berlin, though surrounded by communist territory, remained a small island of Western freedom deep inside East Germany. It was a thorn in the side of the communist government, a constant reminder that another way of life existed. At first, people could move freely between East and West Berlin. The boundary was just a line on a map. Every day, thousands of East Berliners would cross into the Western sectors for work, shopping, or to visit family. But this created a massive problem for the communist government. People could see the difference between the two systems with their own eyes. In West Berlin, shops overflowed with goods. New buildings were rising from the rubble, and people spoke freely without fear. In East Berlin, under communist rule, there were food shortages, constant surveillance, and a gray monotony that seemed to drain the color from life itself. People began to leave. At first, it was a trickle, then a flood. Between 1949 and 1961, nearly 3 million East Germans fled to the West, most of them through Berlin. They were doctors, engineers, teachers, young people who should have been building the future of East Germany. The communist government was hemorrhaging its best and brightest citizens. Something had to be done, and the solution would be brutal. On the night of August 12, 1961, the citizens of Berlin went to sleep in one world and woke up in another. At midnight, under the cover of darkness, East German soldiers began unrolling barbed wire across the city. They worked with desperate speed, knowing that daylight would bring confusion and panic. Mothers couldn't reach their children. Husbands were separated from wives. People rushed to the wire, calling out names, pressing letters and photographs through the barbs, touching hands one last time before soldiers pushed them back. The barbed wire was just the beginning. Within days, construction crews arrived with concrete blocks and mortar. A wall began to rise, crude at first, but growing stronger and higher with each passing week. Walter Ulbricht, the leader of East Germany, had promised just months before that nobody had any intention of building a wall. It was one of history's most blatant lies. The Berlin Wall, as it would be known, was being built not to keep enemies out, but to keep citizens in, a prison wall surrounding an entire country. Over the following years, the wall evolved into something far more sophisticated than simple concrete. The East German government developed what they called the Death Strip, a militarized zone that stretched along the entire border. On the eastern side, there was the main wall, tall and smooth, impossible to climb without equipment. Behind it lay a wide corridor filled with sand, where footprints would be visible to the guards. There were watchtowers every few hundred meters, manned by soldiers with orders to shoot anyone trying to cross. There were trenches to stop vehicles, beds of nails to puncture tires, attacked dogs that roamed on long chains, motion sensors, and banks of blinding floodlights that turned night into day. Finally, on the western side, there was another wall, covered in graffiti and defiant art. Between these two barriers lay a no-man's land where death waited patiently. The official name given by the East German government was the Anti-Fascist Protection Rampart. They claimed it was built to protect their citizens from Western aggression and capitalist corruption. But everyone knew the truth. The guns pointed inward. The wall was a monument to failure, a concrete admission that the communist system could not compete with the West and had to cage its people to prevent them from leaving. Yet human beings are creatures of hope and desperation, and where there is a wall, there will always be those who try to break through it. The escape attempts began almost immediately, and they ranged from brilliantly clever to tragically naive. In the early days, when the wall was still being built, people jumped from apartment buildings on the border, their neighbors holding blankets below to catch them. The East German authorities responded by bricking up these windows and evacuating the buildings entirely. Some people tried to dig tunnels. Beneath the streets of Berlin, groups would spend months excavating narrow passages under the death strip, working in shifts, hauling out dirt in suitcases, living in constant fear of collapse or discovery. Tunnel 57, completed in 1964, successfully brought 57 people to freedom before the East German police discovered it. The diggers were students from West Berlin who had fled themselves and were now risking their lives to save others. Others tried to crash through the checkpoints in armored vehicles. Konrad Schumann, a young East German soldier, was photographed leaping over the barbed wire in the early days of the wall, still in uniform, his rifle hanging from his shoulder. The photograph became an icon of the desire for freedom. But for every successful escape, there were failures. Peter Fechter was 18 years old when he tried to climb the wall in August 1962. He made it to the top before guards opened fire. He fell back into the death strip, wounded, crying out for help. East German guards didn't approach him. West Berlin police couldn't reach him. For an hour, he bled in the sand while people on both sides watched helplessly. When East German guards finally carried his body away, he was dead. He became the 50th person killed at the wall, but he would not be the last. The exact number of deaths at the Berlin Wall remains disputed. The official Berlin Wall Memorial recognizes at least 140 people who died directly because of the East German border regime. Some were shot by guards. Others died in accidents during escape attempts, drowning in rivers or killed in tunnel collapses. Some were simply caught and imprisoned, their spirits broken in jails where they were interrogated, tortured psychologically, and sentenced to years of hard labor for the crime of wanting to leave. But statistics cannot capture what it meant to live in a divided city. For nearly 3 decades, Berlin existed as 2 separate realities. In West Berlin, life was vibrant, chaotic, free. The city became a haven for artists, rebels, and freethinkers. It was subsidized by the West German government and supported by the Allies, who maintained a military presence as a guarantee against Soviet aggression. Young West Germans could avoid military service by moving to Berlin. The city pulsed with music, art, and defiance. Graffiti covered the western face of the wall, transforming it into an enormous canvas. Artists painted messages of hope, images of freedom, and mockery of the regime that had built it. On the eastern side, life was gray and carefully controlled. The government watched everything. The Stasi, East Germany's secret police, had files on millions of citizens. They recruited informants from every workplace, every apartment building, sometimes even from within families. People learned to watch their words, to speak in coded language, to trust no one completely. And yet, ordinary life continued. People fell in love, raised children, celebrated birthdays, and found small joys in a system designed to crush individuality. The human spirit proved resilient even behind concrete walls. As the years passed, the wall became a fixture of the global imagination. American President John F. Kennedy visited in 1963 and declared, "Ich bin ein Berliner." I am a Berliner, expressing solidarity with the divided city. Ronald Reagan would stand at the Brandenburg Gate in 1987 and challenge Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev directly. "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." The wall appeared in countless spy novels and films. It was where East and West met, where the Cold War had a physical form, where you could stand with one foot in each world and feel the tension of an entire era. But by the late 1980s, something was changing. The Soviet Union, the superpower that had seemed invincible, was crumbling from within. Its economy was collapsing under the weight of military spending and an inefficient system. Mikhail Gorbachev, the new Soviet leader, understood that reform was necessary for survival. He introduced policies of glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring. These changes rippled across Eastern Europe, and communist governments that had ruled with iron fists for decades suddenly found their authority questioned. In Poland, the Solidarity movement had forced the government to accept free elections. In Hungary, the government began dismantling its border fence with Austria, creating a hole in the Iron Curtain. East Germans began traveling to Hungary, then crossing into Austria, and from there to West Germany. The Berlin Wall was being bypassed. Thousands were leaving, and the East German government seemed powerless to stop them. Pressure built throughout 1989. In Leipzig, a major East German city, protests began every Monday evening. They started small, just a few hundred brave souls gathering in front of the Nikolai Church. The government threatened violence. They had crushed dissent before. They could do it again. But something was different this time. The protests grew. Thousands became tens of thousands, then hundreds of thousands. The people chanted, "Wir sind das Volk, we are the people." The government blinked. Soldiers who might have fired on protesters kept their weapons lowered. The communist system was collapsing not from invasion, but from the simple refusal of ordinary people to be afraid anymore. The East German government was in chaos. Leaders resigned. New leaders promised reforms, but it was too late for half measures. Pressure came from every direction, people demanding change, demanding freedom, demanding the right to travel to the West. The government tried to write new travel regulations, something that would release the pressure without losing complete control. This is where history turned on a moment of confusion and bureaucratic incompetence. On November 9, 1989, Gunter Schabowski, a member of the East German Politburo, held a press conference. Near the end, almost as an afterthought, he announced that East Germans would be allowed to cross the border. A reporter asked when this would take effect. Schabowski shuffled through his papers, clearly uncertain, and said the words that would change history. "As far as I know, it takes effect immediately, without delay." He was wrong. The regulations were supposed to be carefully implemented with proper procedures. But his words were broadcast across East Berlin, and they spread like wildfire. People heard that the border was open. They rushed to the checkpoints, demanding to cross. Border guards, who had received no orders, tried to call their superiors, but got no clear instructions. The crowds grew larger, more insistent. At the Bornholmer Strasse checkpoint, thousands pressed against the barriers. The guards, faced with an impossible choice between opening fire on their own citizens or giving way, chose humanity. At 11:30 p.m., the barriers rose. People flooded through, running, crying, laughing, unable to believe what was happening. They climbed onto the wall itself, dancing on the concrete that had imprisoned them for 28 years. West Berliners rushed to meet them, strangers embracing strangers, sharing bottles of champagne, celebrating a joy that transcended words. The wall, which had seemed as permanent as mountains, had fallen not to armies or explosives, but to the simple human desire for freedom. The world watched in amazement. Television cameras captured young people with hammers and chisels attacking the wall, claiming pieces as souvenirs. The Mauerspect, wall woodpeckers they were called, pecked away at history, turning the symbol of division into fragments scattered across the world. Within days, official crews began dismantling it properly. Heavy machinery tore through concrete that had stood for nearly 3 decades. The border crossings, once death traps, became party venues. Families separated for decades were reunited. Old men crossed to see neighborhoods they'd been forced to abandon as young men. Young people who had known only division suddenly had an entire city to explore. The joy was overwhelming, but so was the confusion. East Berliners, used to having every aspect of life controlled by the state, now faced a bewildering world of choice. West Berliners had to adjust to a flood of visitors and the reality that their isolated island city was about to be transformed completely. Within a year, Germany reunified. On October 3, 1990, the German Democratic Republic ceased to exist, absorbed into the Federal Republic. It was a victory for the West, for capitalism, for democracy, but the story didn't end with the wall's fall. In many ways, the real work was just beginning. The physical wall could be demolished in months, but the invisible walls proved much harder to break down. East and West Germany had developed differently for 40 years. They had different economies, different cultures, different ways of thinking about work, community, and the role of government. East Germans had lived under a system where employment was guaranteed, but initiative discouraged, where housing was provided, but choice limited, where everyone was theoretically equal, but freedom was non-existent. West Germans had grown up in a prosperous, competitive society where individual achievement mattered and market forces determined success or failure. When reunification came, East German factories couldn't compete with Western companies. Industries collapsed, unemployment soared. Many East Germans felt they had been liberated only to be left behind economically. They had escaped one system only to feel like second-class citizens in another. The West had to invest trillions of marks into the East, rebuilding infrastructure, cleaning up environmental damage from decades of industrial pollution, and trying to bring living standards up to Western levels. This is where the story of Reconstruction begins, the after that continues to unfold even today, 35 years after the wall fell. The reconstruction of Berlin and of Germany itself has been both physical and psychological, a process of healing wounds that concrete alone could never fully represent. The physical reconstruction of Berlin has been extraordinary. Where the wall once stood, most sections have been removed completely, but the path is marked by a double row of cobblestones running through the city. You can walk along it and trace the line of division, a subtle reminder embedded in the sidewalks. In some places, segments of the wall have been preserved as memorials. The East Side Gallery is the longest surviving section, over a kilometer of wall covered in murals painted by artists from around the world in 1990. It has become a tourist destination, though controversy continues about preservation and the commercialization of a site that represents so much suffering. The Berlin Wall Memorial on Bernauer Strasse gives visitors a sense of what the death strip actually looked like. A section has been preserved with the walls, watchtower, and empty space between them intact. There's a documentation center where you can learn the stories of those who died. Photographs show the apartment buildings that once stood on the border, the windows that were bricked up, the desperate escapes. Standing there, you can begin to understand the fear and the courage that defined this place. Near the Brandenburg Gate, the place where Reagan gave his famous speech, you can find rows of white crosses commemorating some of those who died at the wall. The gate itself, which stood in the death strip during the years of division, is now the symbol of a unified Berlin and Germany. It's where people gather for celebrations, protests, and commemorations. The transformation is complete. A symbol of division has become a symbol of unity. Throughout Berlin, construction cranes have been remaking the skyline for decades. The Potsdamer Platz, which was a wasteland of the wall's death strip, is now a gleaming district of modern skyscrapers, shopping centers, and cultural venues. The city has been literally rebuilt, but architects and urban planners have been careful to preserve memory. The topography of terror, built on the site of the former Gestapo and SS headquarters, documents the crimes of the Nazi era. The memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe, a field of concrete blocks designed by Peter Eisenman, opened in 2005, ensuring that Germany's darkest history remains visible and unforgotten. But beyond the physical reconstruction, there has been an ongoing effort to document and process what happened during the years of division. After reunification, the Stasi archives were opened to the public. People could request their own files and discover who had informed on them. Friends discovered that friends had been reporting their conversations. Children learned that parents had collaborated with the secret police. Spouses found out about betrayals. The revelations were devastating, but they were also necessary. Germany made a conscious choice not to bury the past, but to confront it directly, to examine what happened under totalitarian rule, and to learn from it. The process of psychological reconstruction has been complex. The German language even developed a term, Ostalgie, a combination of Ost, East, and Nostalgie, nostalgia. Some East Germans look back on certain aspects of their former lives with fondness, remembering the sense of community, the slower pace of life, the absence of capitalist competition. This doesn't mean they want the wall back or long for the surveillance state, but human memory is complicated. We can miss aspects of a past we wouldn't want to return to. Economic disparities between East and West Germany persist. Even today, wages in the former East are lower, unemployment higher, infrastructure still catching up. Some cities in the East have thrived, attracting investment and young people. Others have struggled with population decline as young people move west for opportunities. The far right has gained support in some eastern regions where people feel left behind by reunification's promises. These political divisions show that walls in the mind can outlast walls of concrete, yet progress is undeniable. A generation has grown up knowing only a unified Germany. For Germans born after 1989, the wall is history, something their parents and grandparents remember, but that they only know from photographs and museums. The differences between East and West are fading, not erased, but becoming less pronounced with each passing year. Berlin itself has been transformed into one of Europe's great cities. It's a center of art, technology, and culture. Startups flourish in neighborhoods that were once divided by concrete. The city's club scene is legendary, its museums world-class, its energy palpable. The scars remain visible for those who look for them, but they're woven into a city that has embraced its complex history and moved forward. The reconstruction extends beyond Berlin and even beyond Germany. The fall of the Berlin Wall symbolized the end of the Cold War, the collapse of the Soviet Union, and the apparent triumph of democracy in capitalism. The world order that had defined the second half of the 20th century crumbled along with that concrete barrier. Eastern European nations joined NATO and the European Union. The threat of nuclear war between superpowers receded. New possibilities opened. But the story of walls hasn't ended. In the decades since the Berlin Wall fell, new barriers have risen around the world. The border between the United States and Mexico has been militarized with walls and fences. Israel has built a separation barrier in the West Bank. Cyprus remains divided. Border walls exist between India and Bangladesh, between Morocco and Western Sahara, between countless neighbors who have decided that barriers provide security. The lesson of Berlin, that walls ultimately fail, that human connection cannot be permanently severed by concrete and wire, seems forgotten or ignored. Technology has created new forms of division as well. Digital walls separate people into filter bubbles and echo chambers. Algorithms show us content that reinforces our existing beliefs, creating invisible barriers between different realities. The internet, which promised to connect humanity, has in some ways become a new kind of wall, separating us into tribes that cannot communicate with each other. The surveillance that the Stasi conducted with filing cabinets and informants is now possible on an unprecedented scale through digital means, raising questions about privacy and control that the East German secret police could only have dreamed of. The reconstruction continues in unexpected ways. Artificial intelligence now plays a role in preserving and reconstructing the past. Advanced computer models can show what divided Berlin looked like, recreating scenes from old photographs and documents. AI can analyze the Stasi archives faster than human researchers, finding patterns and connections. It can restore damaged photographs, colorize black and white images, and even generate voices for historical figures, allowing us to hear history in new ways. This brings us to something profound and strange. The title of this story mentions AI before and after Reconstruction, and it points to how technology is changing our relationship with history itself. Before, history was static, fixed in fading photographs and aging memories. Now, AI can reconstruct lost worlds, showing us what neighborhoods looked like before they were demolished, how the death strip operated, what life was like on both sides of the wall. It can take the fragments that remain and fill in the gaps, creating visualizations that help new generations understand what their ancestors experienced. But this power comes with responsibility. AI can also create false histories, manipulative narratives, deepfakes that distort truth. Just as the East German government rewrote history to serve its purposes, airbrushing defectors out of photographs and teaching a propaganda version of events, so too could AI be used to reshape our understanding of the past. The technology that helps us remember accurately could just as easily help us forget, replace, or distort. The reconstruction of memory, then, is an ongoing project that requires vigilance. The witnesses to the Berlin Wall are aging. Someday, there will be no one left who remembers what it was like to live in a divided city, to risk death for the chance at freedom, to wonder if a wall could ever fall. When that day comes, it will be crucial that we have preserved not just the facts, but the feeling, not just the dates and statistics, but the human stories of fear, courage, hope, and loss. Throughout Berlin today, you can find stumbling stones, small brass plaques embedded in sidewalks in front of buildings. They commemorate individuals who were deported and murdered during the Holocaust. It's a form of memorial that insists on remembering, that makes history literally something you can trip over in your daily life. In a similar way, the preservation and reconstruction of the Berlin Wall story serves as a stumbling stone against forgetting, a reminder embedded in the present of what happened in the past. The reconstruction is also personal, happening in individual lives and relationships. East and West Germans married each other, creating families that bridge the divide. Children of these mixed marriages grow up with both perspectives, their very existence a form of healing. Organizations bring together people from formerly divided communities to share their stories, to process collective trauma, to build understanding. Artists continue to engage with the wall's legacy. Films, novels, plays, and paintings explore what division meant and what unification has meant. The wall appears in video games where players can experience escape attempts, in virtual reality reconstructions where you can stand in the death strip and feel what it was like to face those barriers. Each generation finds new ways to grapple with this history, to ask what it means for their own time. The reconstruction of Berlin and the healing of Germany's division is a story without a clear ending. It's a process that continues, adapting to new challenges and opportunities. Every time a piece of infrastructure is upgraded in the East, every time an economic gap narrows, every time an East-West prejudice fades, the reconstruction advances. And every time political polarization increases, every time economic inequality grows, every time people retreat into tribal identities, the reconstruction faces setbacks. What happened in Berlin 35 years ago remains relevant because the fundamental questions haven't changed. How do we heal divisions? How do we move forward from trauma? How do we preserve memory without being trapped by it? How do we build unity without erasing difference? How do we use technology to remember rather than to forget or distort? The Berlin Wall stands as proof that even the most permanent seeming barriers can fall, that systems that appear unshakable can crumble. That change can happen when people refuse to accept the world as it is. But it also stands as a warning that the work of building something better is harder and slower than the act of tearing something down. That reconstruction takes decades and requires patience, resources, and good faith that aren't always present. Today, if you visit Berlin, you can walk from east to west without noticing the transition, except for those cobblestones marking where the wall once stood. You can eat breakfast in what was the Soviet sector and have dinner in what was the American sector. And the only thing that will mark the difference is the architecture and perhaps the age of the buildings. The city breathes as one again, its heart beating across what was once a scar. But if you pay attention, if you visit the memorials and museums, if you talk to people who remember, you'll find that the past is never quite past. It lives in family stories and neighborhood memories, in the way certain generations speak about work or community, in economic statistics and voting patterns. The wall fell, but its shadow remains, growing fainter with time, but never quite disappearing. The story of the Berlin Wall from 1989 to today is ultimately a story about human resilience and the long, difficult work of healing. It is about how we build walls to solve problems and then discover that walls create more problems than they solve. It's about how tearing down barriers is glorious and necessary, but insufficient, that real reconstruction requires changing hearts and systems, not just landscapes. It's about how technology can help us remember and understand our past while also threatening to manipulate and erase it. And perhaps most importantly, it's a reminder that the divisions we create, whether physical or digital, political or economic, are never as permanent as they seem in the moment. But the damage they cause can echo for generations, requiring conscious, continuous effort to heal, and that the reconstruction of what was broken is a responsibility that falls not just to governments or institutions, but to every individual who chooses each day to reach across divides rather than reinforce them, to remember clearly rather than forget conveniently, and to believe that walls, no matter how high or how heavily guarded, can never permanently separate the human family, that, beneath all barriers, remains one.